the world of politics.
It is visceral, it's more violent, and things are tightening. And we have to be prepared to move as these Russian forces come in from three different sides.
To the world of business.
We've seen real wage growth at the bottom part, in lower paid jobs and industries. But you noted on average that inflation has been higher than nominal wage growth.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Ukraine remains very much at the center of the news, with President Biden talking with his counterparts from Germany, France, and Great Britain just earlier today, and questions about a possible oil embargo very much on the agenda. Welcome now Washington correspondent Joe Matthew. He is host of Sound On every day on Bloomberg Radio. Joe, great to see you there at the White House. So give us a sense of what we know about the discussions going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, welcome back, David. We're now entering the 12th day of this war. Pretty hard to believe. And as we consider what's going on inside this building, a remarkable evolution over the past few days when it comes to attitudes about sanctions toward Russia. To your point, we are now debating the idea of banning oil imports from Russia. This is something that wasn't even being discussed a week ago when cries from Congress began to grow a bit louder. In fact, last Thursday, Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, made the case against that, noting high oil and gas prices. Fast forward 4 days, and indeed, Joe Biden on a secure call today with the leaders of France, Germany, and Britain about this very idea. Those leaders do not seem prepared to do this right now, but that's also why the U.S. is constantly trying to find new sources of energy that could help Europe. There was a delegation, a U.S. delegation, reportedly in Venezuela over the weekend trying to do that very thing, despite the fact that we actually ended diplomatic ties with Venezuela some 3 years ago. David, President Zelensky, though, is asking for more than a ban on Russian oil. He wants a no-fly zone over Ukraine. That is not being considered right now by the Biden administration. Short of that, he says he wants fighter jets. And now the U.S. is reportedly in talks with Poland about providing Russian-made MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. We would then replace those for Poland with U.S.-made jets. David, the Ukrainians know how to fly those MiG fighters, and they believe that it is their best chance to stand up to Russian bombers in the days ahead.
So, Joe, with all this high drama, it's really hard to take our eye off of it and pay attention to anything else. But there is a little thing like actually funding the government coming up Friday of this week. Does the White House have the bandwidth to really deal with that issue as well? We would sort of need to keep our government funded right now.
Well, that's true, and we'll see if it's not just this White House, but this Congress has the bandwidth, because there are new requests from the administration that we've talked about, $10 billion of which would go to help Ukraine, funding for the refugee crisis, along with more than $22 billion in COVID relief spending. It is unclear exactly how this is all going to come together, but there is a vote now tentatively set for the House tomorrow. And David, to your point, they would have to move very quickly for the Senate to get on board and get this done before the lights go out on Friday night.
Okay, Joe, thank you so much for that report from the White House. That's Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. And as I said, you can listen to Joe every day of the week on his radio program, Sound On. That's at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. Well, there are a lot of effects of this Ukraine war. First and foremost, of course, on the people in Ukraine. But we also have to keep our eye on the markets and particularly on the economy. What effect could it have on the economy? To take us through that, welcome now Torsten Slok. He's chief economist at Apollo. Torsten, great to have you back with us. Are we seeing any effects in the economy, do we think, yet, in the data we're seeing from Ukraine?
Not quite yet. I mean, some of the daily indicators that have started to move a little bit, but I mean, there are three transmission channels from what's going on. There's energy prices, there's sanctions, and then there's a broader confidence effect. And these things are going to take time. But what we certainly are seeing is that, of course, financial markets are responding on all three areas, namely, of course, energy prices moving up. And we have also seen some funding stresses because of the sanctions. And, of course, also on the confidence effect, we still will find out, of course, in particular over the next several months, what does this mean for corporate planning? What does it mean for consumers planning? And the bottom line to your question, David, is that it's still very early in terms of figuring out and quantifying the effects of what it means for the economic outlook.
Early to figure out what's going on in Ukraine, not early to address the issue of inflation. We're getting CPI data on Thursday. Do you think that the CPI data we will get on Thursday will reflect at all, in any degree, some of the inflationary forces we're seeing because of this crisis?
No, not yet. And what's really important about your question is that the consensus has expected inflation to peak here in the first quarter But the issue is that now that oil price and commodity prices have gone up so much, that peak has been postponed by at least a few months. So that also means, therefore, that the uncertainty about when will inflation peak and when will inflation begin to come down, that uncertainty will persist. And that becomes very important, not only, of course, for equity markets and rates markets, but also for credit markets in terms of if we have a longer period where we just a few weeks ago thought that inflation was now beginning to come down, if that certainty inflection point has now been delayed by a few months at least, then the risks, of course, are rising that the turbulence we're seeing in markets will continue.
So, Torsten, certainly we have inflation now. As you say, it looks like it may get delayed, the peak of that inflation, so we don't know how long it's going to be. At the same time, a lot of economists are saying we have to take something away from growth now, given what's going on, both in the United States and globally, and therefore we get to that dreaded word stagflation. What's the risk?
Yeah, and that is absolutely correct. I mean, oil prices going up, that's essentially taking money out of consumers' hands that they would otherwise have spent on more productive uses, spending money on energy. Of course, that also helps GDP, if you will. But the bottom line still is that that's very different from people traveling and going on vacation or staying at a hotel or eating at a restaurant. So in that sense, energy prices going up has a lower multiplier on GDP. And therefore, the answer to your question is that, yes, with energy prices going up as much as they are doing at the moment, that is certainly not only going to increase inflation, but also going to lower growth. And that is indeed stagflation. That is the outcome of that.
Okay, let me give you the hard job now. Let me give you the Federal Reserve job, heaven forbid, actually the chair's job. They meet next week. What do they do given all of this? On the one hand, they want to constrain inflation. On the other hand, they want to have to keep growth going.
Yeah, that's really, really difficult. I mean, as we know, and the problem was, of course, that this shock, geopolitical, has hit at a time exactly when inflation was at its peak. I mean, if this had happened 6 months ago, or if this were to happen 6 months in the future, it would have been a very different combination relative to the problems that the Fed is now challenging. So in 9 days, the Fed will have to meet and figure out. They last week have been communicating very clearly that they still expect that a rate hike will be coming, but it is still very uncertain what the outlook looks like. And in particular, this issue about inflation later this week will probably come in at close to 8%, and the Fed's target is 2%. So we are significantly above the target for the Fed. And that's, of course, the problem, that now that we have an even further lift in inflation coming along over the next several months, it really does, to the core of the question that you're asking, raise this issue of do they want to focus on inflation or do they want to focus on the risk that growth might be slowing down? It is a very, very difficult situation for the Fed having to make this decision.
Torsten, you said right at the very beginning, the one thing we know almost for certain coming out of this crisis is we've got an energy price shock going on here, oil as well as natural gas. What are the risks of a recession being triggered by this energy shock?
Yeah, so one very important aspect of that is that even before the Ukraine situation started coming in our screens, we already had a situation where delinquency rates for subprime auto loans and subprime credit cards were already moving higher, which was somewhat puzzling. I mean, delinquency rates should not be going up for any consumer when wage growth is strong and employment growth is strong. So that's why we already have a little bit more vulnerable situation for the consumer that's now being magnified by the energy price increase, which has already also been having a negative impact on consumer confidence more generally. Remember, consumer confidence in the University of Michigan is at the lowest level in a decade. So if we now add more lift to energy prices and consumer confidence is already trending lower because of inflation problems, well, then the risk, of course, is that the consumer could be in for a little bit sharper slowdown, and in the worst case, a much sharper slowdown, and eventually, in the really worst case, a recession, simply because the inflationary pressures that come along with higher energy prices could be so impactful on consumers' behavior and on their decisions.
Torsten, we're in a place that I think a lot of people think we have not really seen before. So it's hard to know exactly where we are and where we're going. But what about some of the traditional indications of how the economy is going? And let me give you two, which is inflation on the one hand and the yield curve on the other, because I've seen graphs and inflation's going up at the same time the yield curve is flattening. That normally is not good news.
That's correct. And that's why if you look at a number of different indicators, for example, if you look at the 1 year, 4 year, 2-10 swap curve, that's telling you that the yield curve in 1 year's time will be inverted. So that's already telling you that the market is now beginning to price that we may have a recession, not in 12 months' time, but maybe more like 18 to 24 months' time. Likewise, on the equity side, if you look at the Russell 2000 relative to the S&P 500, that's at very low levels. People are not buying small cap stocks at this point, which is also a bit unusual, given that the Fed is saying, oh, we have a recovery. Everything is about to take off. Well, if that's the case, why are people so reluctant to buy small cap stocks, and why are they hiding in large cap stocks? So there's a number of areas, to your point, when you look at financial markets, there is indeed a number of worries about a recession risk. But I will say finally, if you type ECFC, go on your Bloomberg screen and look at the upper right-hand corner and ask, what does the consensus expect is the probability of a recession? The answer to that is 15%. So that tells you that the consensus, meaning the economists who submit their forecast, still don't have a recession in their scenario. This was all done pre-Ukraine, of course, but we're watching very carefully whether that probability is going up, because it's clear that financial conditions tightening, inflation and consumer confidence trending lower, that combination is unfortunately raising the risk that we will get a recession.
Torsten, when we're faced with uncertainty, we tend to try to look for precedents in history. Is there anything that seems like a little bit like this? Do you see anything? I mean, for example, Russia had a pretty significant recession back in 1998.
So one thing that's really unusual at the moment is that this is, if you think about this in very simple economics, that now supply of a number of different things, most importantly in energy, is going down. So if there is discussion that the 7 million barrels a day that Russia exports is going to get lower or potentially no longer come to the global market, well, then how can that be replaced? And situations such as this one, where supply in any part of the economy suddenly drops and is at risk of dropping, well, it's very difficult to do demand destruction of the same amount. So in that sense, we have not really seen this combination of shocks hitting the U.S. economy at the moment. And this unfortunate situation that we came into the geopolitical shock with inflation at already very, very high levels is really complicating things for investors in terms of figuring out, well, we already have a significant inflation problem, and now we're adding on top of that a geopolitical problem. Those uncertainties really are the reasons why both rates vol, FX vol, and equity vol, and therefore the broader uncertain environment is likely to continue. And given that this imbalance between demand and supply and energy is going to take most likely at least a few months before that gets cleared out, it is probably also likely that we will see turbulence and volatility in markets for most likely at least a few more months.
Torsten, it's always so very good to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's Torsten Slok of Apollo. Coming up, getting aid to Ukraine with Olena Tragub, former director of the Ukrainian Ministry of Economic Trade and Development. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. And now, keeping you up to date with news from right around the world, here's the first word with Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Ukrainian and Russian officials are meeting again for a third round of talks. But with Russian leader Vladimir Putin saying Kyiv must agree to his demands if fighting is to end, hopes for progress in today's meeting are low. The United Nations says more than 1.5 million people have fled Ukraine since the war started, mostly to Poland and Moldova. The head of the world's nuclear watchdog says Russian forces have destroyed an atomic physics lab under international safeguards in Ukraine's second-largest city. Rafael Mariano Grossi, who leads the International Atomic Energy Agency, says a neutron generator at the Kharkiv Institute of Physics and Technology was destroyed. He says the inventory of radioactive material at the site was small, and monitors detected no radiation release. The U.S. Supreme Court has rejected a group of New York City school workers who wanted to stop the city from firing them for not getting vaccinated against COVID. The employees were seeking a religious exemption from the city's vaccination requirement for teachers and staff. Last month, the city fired more than 1,400 unvaccinated workers, most of them Department of Education employees. More than 5,000 people left Hong Kong Sunday, the most since the city was hit with its most severe and far-reaching wave of COVID. That brought last week's departures to nearly 23,000, up more than 4% from the week before. Those considering coming back face long spells in quarantine. Hong Kong now has the highest COVID death rate in the world. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. All the world is focused right now on Ukraine, and particularly the Ukrainian military, and what their capability is to really resist this invasion from Russia. We now turn to an expert on that subject. She's Olena Tragub. She's executive director of NAKO. It's a Ukrainian anti-corruption NGO, and she used to be director for international assistance coordination at the Ukraine Ministry of Economic Development and Trade. So, Ms. Tragub, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Give us your sense, because you know the Ukrainian military, of how prepared they are and what they need most right now.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. The war in Ukraine has been raging now for over 10 days. And Putin's initial plan of blitzkrieg failed. So what Russians are doing right now, they are surrounding our cities with heavy artillery and bombing them indiscriminately. The civilian population is suffering tremendously. And also they are using the air. They are bombing us from the air with missiles and air bombs. So this is right now where Ukrainian military needs help. On the ground, Ukrainian military is very strong. We saw that Ukrainians were able to repel Russia now for over 11 days, and it was not the plan. But we don't have enough TBT drones. Those are those drones that are like Bayraktars from Turkey. They can destroy Russian artillery, like Grad, like Smerch, because Russians are using those heavy weapons, which are not meant for actually cities, but they are using them on Ukrainian cities like barbarians in a terrible way. And another vulnerability is the sky. This is why Ukraine is asking, close the sky. Give us no-fly zone, and if you cannot do that, please give us equipment to protect our sky, like air defense systems, like jets, like radio electronic equipment. And there are many ways to close the sky, which are absolutely not so risky as American public can actually think, and I can tell you more about it.
So let me make sure I understand this. It's not so much on the ground, it's the air superiority that you need to address. And you're suggesting that the drones that I think come from Turkey, as you say, what about these MiG fighters that have been requested from Poland? Could they integrate that into the Ukrainian military quickly enough to be effective?
Oh yeah, definitely. We have enough pilots right now, because just before the war, Ukraine called for all the reservist pilots that we had in the country. Our pilots are highly talented, but we need much more equipment than just those MiGs. Seriously, Russians, they have a lot of equipment, and their weapons that they are bringing right now onto Ukrainian territory, like the thermobaric rocket launchers, like those heavy artillery equipment which I mentioned. Ukraine doesn't have those, and we need some equipment to fight, to destroy Russian equipment immediately, so that they don't have a chance to harm our cities. And those are drones, yes, and fighter jets, yes, and air defense systems.
Do you have a sense of how much equipment, how much armament is being sent in right now, even as we speak, into Ukraine? The United States certainly has been trying to send in a fair amount. Is it making its way to the front lines?
Well, right now, from what we hear, their efforts intensified, and our actually Minister of Defense said today that Russians will be surprised soon that we received some of the equipment. But generally, I just want to say that there is a very significant delay and hesitation on the part of our NATO partners, on the part of the United States. And, right now, it's going according to Putin's plan, because Putin had a plan that the West will not intervene, that the West will not do anything militarily, and it's happening as he planned, But my call to the West is that they should not be afraid of what Putin says. Even economic sanctions, he said it's the act of war. No-fly zone, he will say it's the act of war. Anything is the act of war. And what is he going to do about it? The West should deter him. The West should prepare and stand up to Putin. That's the best way. Otherwise, we are repeating, the story of Hitler, the story when nobody wanted the Third World War, but it still happened. We may repeat exactly the same scenario right now.
Yeah, well, there's a tragic situation. It's really helpful to hear Ukrainian perspective on this. Thank you so much to Olena Tragub of NAKO. Coming up, markets are pricing in the war in Ukraine. We'll talk about that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Russia invades Ukraine.
We have proven our strength.
The nature of this war changed yesterday.
Turn to Bloomberg for up-to-the-minute reporting from around the world.
Ground troops are closing in on the Ukrainian capital.
Swiss abandon neutrality.
And analysis of what it all means to you.
Energy is on the table.
We could see oil prices moving closer to 120.
There is a lot of interest to offload Russian assets.
Look to see more companies announce their exits from Russia.
Keep it tuned to Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Markets continue to be roiled by that crisis in Ukraine, with equities down today, but also the bonds appear to be selling off. So to explain it all to us, we're delighted to be joined by Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle.
Well, there's just so much confusion and uncertainty out there. And at this point, it's really weighing on these markets, investors not knowing what to do. And the reason that I say confusion is because you have stocks down sharply, but you also have bonds down. So you have growth assets down and you have haven assets down. Now, of course, the asset class really in question right now, commodities, oil all over the map. A bear market and a bull market in one day, David. Brent crude up 18% at the session highs and then basically flat now, up about 5%. So long as oil's up, that's going to act as a pressure on stocks, but it seems likely that you're going to see this surge, this bubble in commodities reverse back down.
Well, but at the same time, one of the things that struck me is we're all talking about oil. It's a big story, oil. Take a look at wheat. Take a look at nickel. Some of the other commodities actually are moving more than oil is.
It's incredible. And the same idea for those commodities as well. It's very unlikely that those parabolic uptrends will continue. The buying is manic because of these headlines, but it could take just one headline to reverse it back down. From a physics perspective, a 90-degree angle cannot hold. Think gold back in 2011, 2012, silver, it just doesn't. It's a manic buying. It's a classic bubble. But the question is, when does it reverse back down?
So one of my questions is, I tend to think about equities in terms of multiples.
Mm-hmm.
At what point is there a repricing of multiples that actually take the multiples down from where we were?
That's interesting. So right now, I would not say that we're anywhere near there. Like in terms of a trough multiple, the last time I looked, the S&P 500 was let's call it around 18 times or so. That's still elevated relative to a longer term mean. So I think that if the S&P 500 were to go to say 16 times forward year or 15 times, that would be pretty low. And then at that point, you'd have some value buyers come out. But right now, you just have so many unknowns because we haven't even talked about the Fed. That's really the bigger macro Fed.
By the way.
Yes, by the way, we have that in the backdrop. So it's just hard for anybody to really have a sense for what's going on here. Just lots of volatility.
Yeah, and who knows what the Fed's going to do? I suspect right as of today, they don't know what they're going to do.
That's an interesting point, David. It would be interesting if they did not at least hike once. Yeah, a lot of variables.
Yeah, but okay.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much. Always great to have you. That's Abigail Doolittle on the markets. Coming up, more on Ukraine and Russian President Vladimir Putin. We're going to be talking with Angela Stent of the Brookings Institution. That is coming up next. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. As the entire world watches Ukraine, all roads really lead back to Moscow and really, frankly, to one person. That is Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and what he is planning to do, what is in his mind. We welcome now somebody who's a true expert on that subject of Vladimir Putin. Angela Stent is senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and with the Rest. So, Professor, thank you so much for being back with us. Let me start with maybe one of the most basic questions. As you know the situation and you know it better than most, do you think there is a path for Vladimir Putin at this point to be persuaded to step down or back from Ukraine? Is there any way to persuade him to change course?
So the Russians are now offered the Ukrainians a deal, which is similar to what they offered before. And they've said, we'll stop this war if you demilitarize, you say that you're going to be neutral forever, you recognize Crimea as part of Russia, and you recognize the two, statelets, the republics and the Donbass. I think that's a non-starter for the Ukrainians. We also hear that the Russians are thinking about possibly leaving President Zelensky in as a sort of president without much power and then putting a prime minister in who's very pro-Russian. So at the moment, I think that is a non-starter for the Ukrainians. And I think in the absence of that, Putin's going to continue to prosecute this war, although frankly, it's not going nearly as well as he and apparently the others around him thought that it would.
Well, that leads me to the question, actually, of why did they get it wrong? I mean, we don't really know, but a lot of speculation is this did not unfold the way he anticipated from all different directions. How resilient the Ukrainian forces are, how much the Ukrainian people necessarily are not welcoming them with open arms. If that's right, if they got it wrong, what in his decision-making structure led to that mistake?
He must have been getting also incorrect information, even from his defense minister, Shoigu. They really thought that Ukraine would capitulate in 2 to 3 days and they take Kiev. And that's why they didn't prepare all those young recruits for a long and bloody war, and which is why you see these young soldiers who really don't know why they're there. It still begs the question of why was their information so bad? Maybe they were just talking to Ukrainians who are more pro-Russian and were giving them false information. But we really don't understand how they could have miscalculated so much to think that the Ukrainians would have surrendered, would have capitulated, and everything would have been over in a couple of days.
So, Professor, let me ask a question that is being asked repeatedly in the press. And in part, I want to know, do you think it's a constructive question? There's a lot of people saying, is President Putin at this point rational? Has he deteriorated in some way? Is he rational? Is that a legitimate question? Is it a constructive question?
I think people look at some of the things that the President Putin's been saying since the war began or before it. They look at his affect and they question whether he's rational. And they use the word unhinged. I think, in his own mind, the idea of trying to conquer Ukraine, subjugate it, reunite it with Russia was perfectly rational given his view on the world. And, we're maybe all armchair psychologists. I think to say that this is irrational isn't very helpful. I think the question is, he's been brooding about all of these issues for years. He's had the 2 years or more in isolation during COVID, and that's maybe reinforced all of his really paranoia about the West and about Ukraine. But I think it would be dangerous just to say that he's irrational, and it's possible that he wants us to think that he's irrational and unhinged, because that would lead us to think twice about taking certain actions against Russia.
Well, and that leads perhaps to the question about tactical nuclear weapons, because a lot of people are saying it's possible he might actually, if he needed to, if he got pressed, use tactical nuclear weapons. Do you think that's something he would even consider?
Well, certainly Russians have been writing about this for a number of years, the possibility of limited nuclear war and the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And we've had these veiled threats from President Putin over the past 2 weeks about if there's too much pushback against Russia, methods will be used that we've never dreamed of. You still have to hope that he understands that using a tactical nuclear weapon would unleash something, and he doesn't know even where that would go. How would the West respond? But I can't tell you 100% that he wouldn't want to do that, because everything that's happened since February the 24th, since this invasion has begun, we've all had to re-question all of the assumptions we had.
When we go back to what he has said, President Putin, and what he's demanded, as you say, at this point, I don't see that Ukraine could possibly agree to what he's demanded. At the same time, is this to some extent, do you think, perhaps a negotiation? That is to say, there might be something short of what he's demanded that might take care of things, some formal neutrality, as it were, of Ukraine, maybe some agreements not to go into NATO. Is there some way that we could persuade President Putin it's good enough?
Possibly. I mean, we've had these series of negotiations. The Israeli prime minister was there on Saturday. He's been consulting with the French president. He then went to Germany and met with the chancellor. Everybody's consulting with President Biden. And President Zelensky himself has hinted that neutrality isn't off the table. The question is, would that be enough to satisfy the Russians if they then leave in power a government that, of course, is still going to be very anti-Russian, given what happened? But certainly diplomacy should be tried. It is being tried. And I know that people are also trying to figure out whether the Chinese indeed could be helpful here. So we can't give up on that.
Yeah, actually, we're going to talk to the former U.S. ambassador to China, Gary Locke, next in this program. But just one last one, if I could, Professor. And that is, if you were advising the U.S. government right now about what to do and what not to do to try to maximize the chance of some off-ramp, as it were, what would you advise?
Well, I think the sanctions have already been imposed. I know there's a lot of pressure to sanction the entire Russian energy industry. this might not be the time to do it, just because that also affects all of our allies, other countries in the world. And I think, since that's a huge source of revenue for Russia, if you're trying to do an off-ramp, maybe this isn't the time to do it, and you have to hold that in reserve if really nothing else helps.
Okay, Professor, it's always a great privilege to have you with us. That's Professor Angela Stent of the Brookings Institution and author of Putin's World. Coming up, former U.S. Ambassador to China, Gary Locke. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. As we just talked about with Angela Stent, China could play a key role in resolving the crisis in Ukraine if it decided it wanted to be. We remember at the beginning there was solidarity expressed between President Xi and President Putin, but since then, maybe not quite as much as we would have expected. We turn now to somebody who's a real authority in China. He's Gary Locke, former U.S. ambassador to the country. He was also former U.S. Commerce Secretary and former governor of the state of Washington. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. Let me start with the most basic question. Does China have a policy with respect to Ukraine right now?
Well, China's always had the policy of staying out of the affairs of other countries and urging other countries to respect the sovereignty all across the world of other countries. And so it's in a predicament because China recognizes the independence and sovereignty of the Ukraine, but also has very close ties with Russia. China has been trying to maybe play it both ways. They did not join in the UN resolution condemning the Russian invasion or the actions of Russia toward Ukraine. But they have also said that it's the fault of the West for what's happening in Ukraine, and that NATO should never have gotten that close to the borders, and that that really it needs to be solved by the West. At the same time, they have not supported Russia. They're trying to stay neutral because they also have very close political and economic ties to Russia.
Does President Xi and China more generally, does it benefit or really be hurt by turmoil around the globe, particularly as it affects global economies?
Well, anytime there's turmoil in the global economy, China will suffer because if spending across the world is down, the demand for Chinese goods, whether it's in the United States, I mean, if people's are very wary, if the stock market goes haywire, goes south, I mean, the uncertainty of the U.S. economy affects people's purchase of Chinese-made goods. And the same thing with exports from China to Europe. So this is being watched very, very carefully in Beijing. At the same time, China could stand to benefit a little bit from Russia. If Russia's not able to sell some of their goods and natural resources, oil and gas, to Europe, they would be able to sell that to China. So China could benefit in some ways from the turmoil, but they also risk possible sanctions if the West says people who support Russia, who do trade with Russia, if the West could say, we're going to sanction those secondary countries. And so China is in a very, very precarious situation, is watching these developments very carefully.
Let me just explore that for a moment, because some people are concerned that perhaps some of the sanctions being imposed by the West and the United States and Japan might actually not be as effective because China would buy, for example, oil and wheat from China. How big a risk is that they could really take a good deal of the sting out of the sanctions?
Well, Russia exports, China is Russia's largest export market trading partner. But China does so much more trade with the rest of the world. And so China has to be very, very careful that if they do business with Russia, that they don't become a victim of sanctions by the rest of the world, which would be even more crippling, much more significant than any gain that they might get from doing trade with China, whether it's buying natural gas and oil or agricultural commodities.
How does the regime in China likely regard what's going on with Ukraine with respect to Taiwan? Do they see a connection between those two? I saw the foreign minister of China today actually draw a specific connection. Do they see a real connection between Ukraine on the one hand and Taiwan on the other?
Well, the Chinese government in Beijing will say that these are two separate situations, that Ukraine is a separate country and that all countries should respect the sovereignty of other nations. But Beijing will say that Taiwan is not a separate country. It's really a breakaway province of China, and that it has every right to assert its authority over Taiwan. Now, of course, the United States also has a defense treaty with Taiwan and says that, the issues between the mainland and Taiwan must be resolved peacefully, amicably by the people and by the governments. And that force should never be resorted to, which is why we sell quite a bit of military equipment, jets and arms to Taiwan. So we're trying to be very, very firm. That's why, for instance, over the last several months, top U.S. government officials have been visiting Taiwan. But at the same time, we've been saying that both sides need to exercise restraint. I think Beijing is going to watch very carefully the extent of the sanctions imposed by the West against Russia, because also if China were ever to take military action to force a unification or reunification between Taiwan and the mainland, they know that the West would impose very severe sanctions. And so they're going to really gauge the actions of the West with respect to the Russia-Ukraine situation. Finally, at the same time, knowing that there might be severe repercussions against any military action towards Taiwan, China has been trying to decouple its economy, trying to be much more independent, less reliant on high technology and goods and services from the West.
Great. Thank you so much. Always a great privilege to have you with us. That's the former U.S. Ambassador to China. He is Mr. Gary Locke. Coming up, more on the market sell-off. Plus, we'll take a look at the midterms and a special focus on Texas. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. The markets continue to really be suffering because of that war in Ukraine. And to get an update now, we turn once again to Abigail Doolittle. So what's happened since we talked last, Abigail?
Well, pretty much the same, David. We have a serious sell-off for stocks. The S&P 500 down for a third day, right now down about 2.2%. That's the worst day in more than a month. So investors nervous. It's on above average volume, 30% above the 20-day moving average. And of course, you have that VIX higher, although not as high as its last high. So there's reason to think at some point this stock volatility may temper at some point here in March. And supporting that idea are the fact that bonds actually falling. That 2-year yield up about 4 basis points, the 10-year yield about flat. But the biggest mover to watch, David, of course, crude oil, the commodity complex really soaring. That said, it's well off its highs. At session highs, you had oil, Brent crude up 18%. Right now, WTI crude up about 2%. If and when commodities come back down, that will probably provide a little bit of a breather for stocks.
Well, it raises the question, at least in my mind, the if and when they come back down. I mean, certainly things return to something like normal sooner or later, but it could be a long time. And doesn't it depend necessarily on what goes on in Ukraine, what goes on in Moscow, what goes on in Western capitals?
Very hard to predict, and it probably will come on some sort of fundamental headline or event or evolution of the tragedy, quite frankly, the humanitarian crisis going on over in Ukraine, that war between Russia and Ukraine. Let's see what happens. It could have something to do with oil. So many different headlines, so many different moving pieces. But these markets way overheated, overbought beyond parabolic uptrends that we've been talking about. At some point, these kinds of moves are unsustainable. What will trigger a move toward the downside? It's hard to know. It's hard to know when that will come, but probably sooner rather than later, David, especially given the fact that, again, Brent crude earlier today up 18%. Right now, Brent crude up 4%. So when you have that kind of movement on the day, it suggests that maybe there's going to be some sort of movement overall back down, a reversal of some sort.
Well, movement is certainly what we're seeing. And if you stay with Bloomberg, you'll find out what it is about from people just like Abigail Doolittle. Thank you so much, Abigail. That was terrific. Moving now to make a big move, actually, to politics in our weekly midterm segment. I'm joined now by Bloomberg political contributors Jeannie Shanzano of Iona College and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. So we're going to look back here, if we can, get in the Wayback Machine to last week when I was away. But there was, besides the State Union, Rick, there was a little thing called a primary or set of primaries down in Texas. Tell us what we learned from those primaries, Rick.
Well, it was interesting because of both the turnout being very large. It exceeded the 2018 midterm elections, a primary vote. And Texas is not known for its big turnouts. So having that many 3 million voters show up on primary day was extraordinary. I'd say the second piece to that is 2 of the 3 million voted in the Republican primary. So that's got to give Democrats some pause that their turnout machine was not as motivated as the Republicans.
Yeah, and I think this is why we see the winner of the Democratic primary for governor in Texas, Beto O'Rourke, is talking about bringing in 65,000 volunteers, to which Greg Abbott, who won the Republican primary, the incumbent, he said they're going to turn around with 100,000, and those 65 are largely from out of state. So in addition to being a battle of money, which of course Abbott is winning, we are going to see a battle of volunteers down in Texas as they look to the all-important general election in November.
Rick, some of the commentators suggested there was sort of a shift, perhaps to the left overall, where basically the progressives did relatively better on the Democratic side, and frankly, who did well on the Republican side were not at least the extreme right wing. It was more the traditional. Is that true, number one? And number two, if so, does it tell us anything more generally about the midterms?
Yeah, there were a couple of districts, congressional districts, where progressive candidates won the vote, but the reality is on the composite scale, it's just a couple people. It won't even double the size of the squad in Congress, which is all of 8 or 10 people. So I think there were very few surprises, actually. Most of the incumbents won. Everybody Donald Trump endorsed basically won, but he endorsed a lot of front runners. So that's always a nice thing to do. I think the one surprise is in the Attorney General's race, where Ken Paxton, who is under investigation by the FBI, has been indicted and has corruption charges, actually did pretty well in his primary. But the surprise was George P. Bush, the scion of the Bush family in Texas. It looks like he's made his way into the runoff. And so that will become, I think, one of the premier runoff races yet to come.
Yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind here is we really are seeing the death of competitive districts across the country with the gerrymandering that's going on. I mean, one of the statistics we hear is that 90% of the House that is elected in the fall could have gotten their election via primaries versus via a competitive general election. And I think as we think about the issue of political polarization and extremism, we have to be very cognizant when we hear things like the heckling in the State of the Union, that when you are deciding that many races in very competitive primaries and not so competitive general elections, that is where Democratic and Republican politics in Washington is headed in the next couple of years.
Rick, maybe the death of competitive districts, it doesn't look like the death of really big fundraising. Is the one thing we know about this midterm is that there's going to be a lot of money raised?
Yeah, I mean, Jeannie mentioned this governor's race. Governor Abbott has already raised almost $50 million. Wow. Compared to under $10 million for Beto O'Rourke. We just heard today that Mike Pence, who, we've been hearing more from lately, his political action committee has just put $10 million of advertising into a number of congressional districts where they think they can upset the Democratic incumbent. And so you have some pretty big chunky spending along the way here. And I think these will just continue, and you'll see record spending in this midterm election cycle.
So, Jeannie, picking up on what Rick just talked about, that $10 million, I read that piece, I think, in Politico, and it said it was addressing COVID and Ukraine, thinking Democratic candidates for Congress might be vulnerable in Ukraine. Do we think Ukraine might play in this midterm in some way?
Republicans really do. On Ukraine, the president's numbers for handling it are good, but what Mike Pence, sorry, I almost said Romney, what Mike Pence is trying to hit the Democrats on is the rising prices in terms of oil and gas and the fact that the United States remains dependent on Russian oil. I think there's a very important communication message Democrats have to get out there, which is the idea that it is not a binary choice. We can do both, fight climate change and help Ukraine. And that is a message they're going to have to work on.
Okay, thank you so much. It's always great to have the two of you here, our political contributors, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter. That's on the terminal and also online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to former U.S. Ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried. Among other things, as we know, there's been a request now that Poland provide MiG jets, fighter jets, to Ukraine. That's pending, as far as I understand. This is Balance of Power, and we are on Bloomberg Television. We are also on Bloomberg Radio.